Okay, do I proceed? Thanks. So the way we look at climate change from the African continent, we look at climate change from different strands. One, climate change being a justice issue. A justice issue because we are a continent that contributes only 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, but yet very highly impacted by climate change. And this calls for the means of implementation from developed countries, and that is the push, one of the key asks for the African continent in the climate change negotiations. Provision of the climate finance that is required for adaptation efforts, provision of the technology that is required for advancing climate change adaptation and mitigation, then the provision of the required capacity for African continents to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. But that differentiation is not being well respected in the international climate change negotiations. There is a lot of shifting of goals by developed countries in the provision of the means of implementation of what is required for countries in Africa to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The other strand that how we look at climate change from the African continent is from an economic perspective. Climate change has really impacted the livelihoods and the economies of most of the African countries, hence hampering development. We have been left to choose whether to develop or to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Basically because much of our livelihoods is dependent on the environment, which is highly impacted by climate change. So our resources that are meant to advance development in terms of roads, in terms of the health structure, in terms of education, much of those resources have been diverted to respond to the climate change crisis. And therefore, as a continent, we become very vulnerable. We can't develop just because most of our resources are diverted to the impacts of climate change. Number three, the other strand on how we look at the climate change aspect is a food security issue from the African continent, because Africa is highly dependent on the agricultural sector, like I've said, and being dependent on the agricultural sector, a sector that is highly affected by climate change, most of the African countries are food insecure. And therefore, we have a lot of resources that are being diverted to providing food security or enhancing food security, hence hampering development as well. The other fourth strand on how we look at climate change from the African continent is from the gender justice perspective. In the African continent, the way gender roles are arranged is in a way that women perform most of the duties at the local level, especially in local agricultural practices, in looking for water, in looking for cooking fuel, and that is wood. But with the impacts of climate change, you find that most of the water sources have dried up. So women have to walk very long distances to go and access water. They have to walk very long distances to go and look for firewood. And that differentiation in terms of the roles that men and women play in responding to the climate crisis as a gender component and a gender justice component. So in addressing the climate crisis, then it is important to look at how do we ensure that we have balanced roles for men and women, ensuring that women do not suffer because of the impacts of climate change in providing water sources that are available, in providing sustainable sources of energy at the local level, and that also requires resources in terms of capacity. It requires resources in terms of technology. It requires resources in terms of putting up structures like the water structures, and we look at it from that perspective, from a gender perspective. And the last aspect, the way we look at climate change from the African continent, is basically as a development issue. And like I said, this is linked to the economic aspect, meaning that we cannot develop because much of our resources are being channeled to the climate change perspective. But engaging at the global level is very critical in ensuring that the international mechanism provides a mechanism that provides support for African countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And that's why myself and other actors from Africa have been engaged in the climate change negotiation at the international level in ensuring that we champion for climate justice issues from the African continent, in providing the climate finance that is required, in providing the capacity that is required and the technology that is required. From the international climate change negotiation, I've just been there yesterday in Bonn, I could tell you the required financing is not flowing. So my rallying point to the young people like you, the CCI fraternity, and the young people engaged in the Fridays for Future, I know you are also championing for climate justice aspects. I think we need to amplify our voices in ensuring that we really put more efforts in championing for the flow of climate finance resources or the means of implementation for developing countries like in Africa. I think the COP in Egypt also provides an opportunity for us to actually build a strong movement, moving to COP27, championing the support that is required for Africa. And you have a very good opportunity because COP is in Africa. We have been championing for the resources for the loss and damage because we have lost properties, we have lost livelihoods, we are losing even our own livestock and even other sources of livelihoods because of climate change. Within the international climate change negotiation and even in the Bonn negotiations this week and last week, countries have been negotiating in terms of ensuring that we have loss and damage finance. But I would say several countries in the global north are blocking the financing aspect for climate finance. And to me, I can also rally you also to join the international movement of the civil society, young people across the continent in championing for provision of the loss and damage finance. And that should be one of the key asks in the upcoming COP27. But just to move ahead with my presentation, I have just a few slides and looking at the IPCC report. The latest IPCC report speaks of the heat stress, water scarcity, food security, food risks, all which are impacting the African continent. And this resonates with the key issues that the African continent is facing. Within the IPCC Working Group 2 report, and the IPCC is the scientific arm of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They do most of the research, and the research is very evident. And now they are providing linkages between interaction between ecosystem, human society, and also the emerging risks of climate change and ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. But the big question is, how do we shape the change, or do we control? So I think we are at a very strategic point as young people to shape how the world will look like and how that world looks like. I know the developed North is looking at just transition, but from the African continent, we look at just transition from another perspective. I will be sharing our views on how we look at just transition. So the climate crisis, the way we look at it from the African continent and some of the social movements from the North in Germany and other countries, they're also looking at it from a social perspective and a social crisis. So limiting the climate crisis, looking at it from a social challenge, the climate crisis threatens the life and the well-being of millions of people, essential human rights, the right to water, the right to food, the right to health, the right to housing, which are all at risk because of climate change. And the economic losses today globally, we're looking at 520 billion USD annually just because of climate change. Then limiting the climate crisis, it's an issue of addressing an international justice. So all countries, based on the Paris Agreement, we are supposed to limit our global emissions way below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the historical responsibility of the North is quite important because the North has contributed highly of the greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to see the fair share of them taking responsibility in providing the adaptive capacity that is required. And Africa is at the risk and has the least capacity to adapt. the bad news or the good news. In order to avoid the runaway climate change, we must cut down our global emissions. If you look at the concluded Glasgow climate change negotiations last year, if you aggregate the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs of most of the countries, it is taking us to around 2.4 degrees Celsius. We are not yet there, but if you look at all these NDCs, they also require some sort of support, both conditional and unconditional, in addressing the climate crisis. So that means that even if you aggregate the NDCs, we are far away from addressing the climate crisis because those NDCs require much of the support, which is not flowing. The technologies and financial resources for transformation needs to be available. But the biggest problem is the lack of the political will. We need to call our leaders because in the last COP in Glasgow, we had very good statements from all countries. Commitments, even the US President Biden was in Glasgow. We had Angela Merkel that time before we had the new chancellor in Germany now. They also have very good statement. The Prime Minister of Barbados, my president from Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, was there. Beautiful statements on what countries need to do in addressing the climate crisis. But when you go to the negotiations rooms, because I am a negotiator as a young person from Kenya, negotiating one of the agenda items on response measures, you will find that the same countries that are having very beautiful statements in the global summit, the leaders summit, they are the same countries that are blocking some of the key decisions, especially for support for the African continent. I think as young people, as a social movement moving to COP27, we need to call our leaders just to stop the blah blah, and they should mean what they say. If they have good statements in terms of commitment for financing, providing the support that is required, then they need to honor it in the negotiation rooms. Let that text and the decisions from COP27 align with what our leaders are saying, so that at least we are able to address the climate crisis. But why a just transition, and from the African continent, how this should look like? We have to move fast, and moving fast, this means that we need to avoid the impacts of climate change. But of much importance, as we move in addressing the climate crisis, we need to move just. That means that we need to limit the negative implications for affected communities and ensure social cohesion. And this is where just transition comes in as a bridge between the climate, social, and economic policy. Many challenges of the climate policy are no longer technological or economic, but rather social and political. So when you look at the just transition, it's an inclusive support mechanism of climate action and not a concept to slow down action. It is an opportunity for us to ensure that we plan security, we create jobs, we ensure social safety and sustainable development for regions like Africa, and strengthen public infrastructure. But that kind of transition, the way it looks like in the global north, has to be very different from how it looks like in the global south. So some current interpretations retain a particular focus on directly impacted workers, but for us from the African continent, we need to look at it from a community perspective. How do we ensure that our communities have access to water? How do we ensure that our transformation, be it in the energy sector, provide, of course, green jobs? Like in Kenya, we have invested more than 90% of our energy comes from the renewable energy. So we have no question about the transition to renewable energy. But the big question is where this technology, for example, is coming from. Much of the technology in renewable energy is coming from the north. So who is providing that expertise in terms of renewable energy? What Africa needs is a support in terms of increasing the technical capacity for our own African countries, to tap into the new jobs that come with the new technologies. We want developed countries not to just bring their technology, but also train our people to tap into those jobs that come with the renewable energy. We also need that support to even develop our own technologies, not to be entirely dependent on the north. And those are our key asks within just transition. But just transition is, of course, a content topic. It basically the debates are required in sectors of the real economy and finance. The climate ambition and just transition are two sides of the same coin. As we aim at reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, of course, the other aspect is looking at the social aspect, and that's where just transition meets the aspect of moving fast in addressing the climate crisis. So we require our governments to shape very quickly and providing planning security for our own countries, leave the comfort zone, listening and also asking the tough questions. Where is the financing coming from? What is the finance doing? Where is this technology coming from? And how do African countries also tap into the technology that comes with addressing the climate crisis? So what can we do as a community? We can engage in communities, sensitize and educate, have dialogues, contribute to development of just transition plans, monitor the implementation of the just transition plans. But from a sectoral perspective, we need to look at the critical sectors where African countries are being affected, establish just transition committees, adopt sectoral policies for just transition. We also need to sensitize and educate workers, train and reskill vulnerable workers. So the other aspect is the policy aspect. For us to address the climate change crisis, then the NDCs are very critical. Germany and other countries in the north have also provided their NDCs and where they want to go in terms of the addressing the climate crisis. Most of the NDCs in Africa have both conditional and unconditional support, meaning that we can only implement our NDCs if we are provided with the support up to a certain degree. So that calls for the international community and the international financing mechanism to provide the required support for our countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So it means that we will not be able to implement our NDCs if the climate finance and the other support is not flowing as expected. So let us work on that. Let us champion for those key demands in the international climate change financing mechanism. So we really need to look at specific context, how countries can shape the just transition. How do we partner with, for example, the civil society actors from the north? CCI becomes a key actor. How can we enhance our partnerships with other key institutions like the Center for Climate Action, which is a grassroots, which is also a local NGO that I champion. I also work on local communities. How can CCI and other of the Fridays for Future movement also partner with other key civil society in the global south in championing for issues that resonate to Africa? Which like-minded institutions from the north can we work with? How can we collectively work on the issue and come up with innovative initiatives in addressing the climate crisis? So alliance building is very critical. Change is not new. This time we must make it sure that it is participatory and just, putting people at the center of addressing the climate crisis. We need to move away from putting business interest into addressing the climate crisis, because that's where the problem is. We need to put people who are the front line of the climate crisis at the center of addressing the climate change problem. And that's how we can place social issues at the center of the climate change crisis. There are no jobs on a dead planet, even if we behave differently from the north or the south. We must address the climate crisis so that we secure our jobs as young people for the current generation and for the future generation. There is no healthy planet with a social cohesion. We must put people at the center of this discussion. We need to work with other allies that we have not been working together. For example, civil society, trade unions. We need to see what issues can bring us together. Our civil society colleagues from the north, what issues can we work on together? For example, the loss and damage issue. How can we build a movement that responds to the key priorities in addressing the climate crisis? Just transition is a big opportunity to co-create in public infrastructure. Good, we need to unionize jobs in the net zero economy. We need to strengthen our regions, better the quality of services, and climate-proof our communities so that they are not highly impacted by climate change. So the concept of just transition provides a framework to be adopted in different contexts. Thus, developing countries such as Africa, it's important for labor and also international environmental justice groups to work together. I think standard if we work together, we'll be able to achieve much rather than our disintegrated efforts in working differently. The process must be inclusive, based on open dialogue that considers the concerns of all. We also need to ensure that stakeholders have a key role to play in the design and the implementation of any plans at the local level. This includes communities, workers, employers, young people, civil society, government. Even more, it's imperative that just transition plans are designed based on specific sectors. It is also important that we get on board to define and design the most suitable framework and pathways for a specific context. From COP26 moving to COP27. COP26 was held in Glasgow last year. We just had the intersessionals that ended the day before yesterday because I traveled to Kenya just last night in Germany, but now moving to Egypt. What should we look at? From these pictures, you can see what was happening in Glasgow last year. You can see a lot of challenges in accessing the rooms. The key issues that we should also champion as young people is the space of young people and civil society within negotiations. We need, before COP27, rally the UNFCCC in ensuring that young people are able to access COP27, are able to have spaces to champion them for demanding for climate justice. You can also see the other challenge. We also had the electric buses, but on the contrary, they are also using dirty energy. So the contrast between what you see and what practically is happening in those countries, it's a contrast. Also, you can also see what happened. Global leaders, we had the World Leaders Summit, like I've spoken about, very beautiful statements, but nothing is happening. Also, art from young people, climate education is our right. You can also see civil society championing for our rights. I think we need to do more on this. Young people, let us prepare ourselves in ensuring that in COP27, we have more actions that are able to even enter into the negotiation rooms. This is here myself negotiating behind the closed doors in negotiations. I was with the permanent secretary. I negotiate for Kenya in terms of the response measures agenda item. That's why I'm saying what happens within the room, it's very different from what people say in the rooms. A lot of blocking in terms and a lot of lobbying, but we need to encourage and speak to our countries in ensuring that what they speak translates to action. COP in negotiation rooms, of course, there are two sides, the blue and the green zones, where we have the real negotiations. We have also the green zones where more action the civil society are, but we need to champion that we have access to both areas, because in the blue zone, you'll find that most of the civil society are blocked, but we need to also have spaces there. Agenda items include climate change adaptation, mitigation, climate finance as the key items, issues of technology and capacity building. We also have negotiating blocks. For example, the African group of negotiators, we have the European Union as a bloc, the G77 and China, the least developed countries, the small island states, and the Arab groups are the different negotiating blocks. You guys from the north, you need to talk to your EU, the European Union partners, or the negotiating bloc, in ensuring that they also have a point of listening to the African continent and the key issues, so that in the negotiation rooms, we are able to push for issues that resonate with our continent. Some tactics, you can have stands, you can have demonstrations, but also depends on how the UNFCCC and those countries allow for this. So let us champion before COP27. We have spaces for civil society, young people, especially in championing for climate justice. We need to strategize as early as possible. Let us come up with small grassroots movement that can build up into the international climate financing mechanism. In COP26, of course, we had an outcome that is not favorable. I don't want to go there, but the key priority issues at COP26 were an outcome that is very fair and equitable, and that remains the same for COP27. We also want an effective implementation of the Paris Agreement for providing the climate finance that is required, and also the adaptation adaptation that is required. The special needs and circumstances for Africa still remains a key agenda for the upcoming COP. The adaptation, reaching an agreement on the global goal and adaptation remains a key agenda in COP27. The issue of loss and damage is a big issue. And if you look at the social media channels of what climate justice movements are speaking about, it's basically the loss and damage issue, because in the previous negotiations, just because it will be a big issue in COP27, we start championing as early as possible what this means and the need to commit the financial resources for loss and damage. Towards COP27, we have to play a critical role for Africa's mobilization towards COP27, support strategic engagement, enhance the engagement between the trade unions and also the civil society actors, shaping our position. For example, in Kenya, shape our position on climate change. You young people, you also need to be engaged on climate change. You young people, you also need to be engaged in building a position. Let us build alliances between young people and other climate justice movements globally in ensuring that we have an outcome in COP27 that is inclusive, an outcome that is just, and an outcome that represents the views of the vulnerable in addressing the climate crisis within the African continent. This is me, together with other justice. Let us build our solidarity together. I think we can. Thank you very much for attention. I can receive. Thanks, Carl. That's a good question. And just to say that it depends, because in Glasgow, we agreed on the Glasgow dialogue that should continue the conversation on loss and damage in towards COP27 and the upcoming COPs. In Bonn, just the last 2 weeks, we had another dialogue, another Glasgow dialogue that shared stories on loss and damage from the different countries, what climate change is doing in terms of livelihoods, loss of livelihoods in African continent, and even in the small island states. But the Santiago network that was established in the previous COPs in addressing the loss and damage issue, we continued this discussion in Bonn. And what is happening at the moment is the creation of just structures and advisory boards. And what I see happening in that strand of the loss and damage is the creation of institutions dragging the conversation or translating the loss and damage conversation just to be another dialogue or just to be another talk. So I think moving to COP27, being held in Africa, I would say we have a space to push for the loss and damage agenda. If we put more pressure, you young people from the North and the climate justice movements globally, we can have an acceleration, because what we want is the acceleration and a commitment on financing for loss and damage. And that is what we are lacking within the negotiation rooms. So I would say all is not yet lost. If we put more pressure, and you can work on this through social media, through Twitter, you can have campaigns with your EU colleagues as a momentum towards COP27 in rallying for loss and damage financing or loss and damage support ahead of COP27. And if we have a strong voice and we are in solidarity between the countries in the north and south and the social movements in the north and south, I think we can build a strong case that can push these countries to commit to something in COP27. If we don't do this, I think we'll continue with the same shifting of goalposts, continue with useless dialogues and useless talks that are not translating to anything. I think we really need now to come strongly and say that enough is enough in terms of the blah, blah, the much talk without action, because COP27 is an implementation COP. Is an implementation COP because we must agree on the implementation mechanisms for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage in ensuring that not only countries in Africa, but other small island states and other developing countries implement their NDCs globally. Therefore, if we do not implement our NDCs and if we do not put a strong voice in providing the support that is required, I think we will continue with the same talk for years to come and we will not see much action. So let us work together. Let us rally young voices, Fridays for Future, CCI, youth movements from the north, also collaborate with youth movements from Africa, because we have civil society actions. We also planning a caravan from the African continent, actually, mobilizing key civil society in various countries towards Egypt. And that caravan will also pass through various countries. So if we have a way of collaborating and ensuring that we work together on this in calling for the support that is required and the acceleration of provision of the required support through actions and through mobilization, activist activities, stands, I think we can push our countries to commit to something. Thanks. Yes, I can hear you. Come up again. Are you speaking about the debt? The debt for climate? Okay, yes. Yes, yes. Thanks. Yes, the debt issue and the climate crisis. That's very good. Thanks a lot for that, because I think it's also important we look at the debt aspect. Most of the African countries are in debts, and some of the debts are attributed to channeling some of our resources to respond to the climate crisis. So I think as from a justice perspective, because we also trying to see how we pay for debts from our African continent. The only thing that can be done, and one of the things that we can call for, is also for flexible mechanisms for African countries in paying for debts because of the climate change crisis. That's how we look at it from the African continent, because much of this debt is even difficult for our countries to pay for the debts. Because much of our resources from economic budgets are being channeled to responding to climate crisis. So we need to call for flexibility mechanisms in paying for our debts. We also, but of course, we also have other issues, fiduciary issues within our own countries. Contexts differ just on how countries use their debt. But I think the linkage between climate change and debt in Africa is very important, and it could be favorable for the African continent if we have flexible mechanism of paying up debt, because much of the climate crisis has forced our countries countries to use resources that can pay up the debts or can accelerate development to pay up the debts. But I think it's a concept that we need to build up. It's not something that is well being understood even at the international level. So I would say that let us work on the issue a bit further. Let us look at, from a debt perspective, what that really means in the different contexts, so that when we have policy issues or key policy options, that we are clear on what we mean from a debt perspective, because that also differs from one country to the other on how we look at the debt issue. Yes, Paula? Yeah, thanks. I think first it's quite contradictory that developing countries and the European Union leaders commit to transition into low carbon development pathways and also adopting renewable energy technologies. I think the push for the gas and other non-renewable energy sources contradicts basically what they commit to do in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So from the African point of view, of course, the key issue is, do you explore oil and gas at the expense of the environment? Of course, we have a right to development. But from a climate change perspective, of course, the choice is to totally transition to renewable energy sources. But we have countries in the north that are still using non-renewable energy sources like coal, oil, and even gas to drive their economies. But we also have the same leaders coming to Africa and also looking at the same sources of renewable energy. I think we need to call on our leaders that they should commit to what they say and mean what they say in terms of the transition to low carbon development pathway, because they are now putting the African continent to even a more risk of going through what most of the European countries are going, because using non-renewable energy sources in Africa, it has more detrimental or negative impacts that will even cost Africa more than what is happening in the north, because in the north, you guys have an adaptive capacity and capacities to even respond to some of the issues that come with the non-renewable energy technologies and the use of it. But within the African continent, if that trend advances, then it will have a big implication in terms of livelihoods and the health of the African population. So let us call on our leaders that they should not push the African continent to move to the dirty energy sources of energy. We should remain in the pathway of transitioning to low carbon development pathway. I think what that means is that let us help our on African countries to to advance technologies in renewable energy, ensure that we have the skill set that is required to tap into the new jobs that come with the renewable energy sector. We have the skills that and the resources that are required to even come up with innovations that support renewable energy and not to move back to the dirty energy that is currently being used in the north. So let us advance our campaigns on that issue, because that will not help, and it will even accelerate more problems in Africa, like the war that we are seeing in Russia. In most of the African countries where we have oil in Nigeria, for example, and in countries in the north, we have a crisis in terms of war. If that happens in Africa, and the EU tries to advance the non-renewable energy sources, the dirty energy discussion in Africa, that will even create more problems in terms of war and some kind of unsettlement. So let us ensure that we block the agenda of pushing African countries to access the non-renewable energy sources of energy. Yes. Thanks a lot. Very good question. And yeah, from where I sit, I think over the last 30 years, we've wasted a lot of time. And I would say that we have a lot of talk and empty talk. We seem to be enjoying the conference rooms and the air conditioners in the negotiation rooms. We seem to be enjoying traveling in many countries, and most of these COPs are also held in tourist sites. I think I would say for the last 30 years, we must ask for accountability, and accountability on what these COPs have delivered in the last 30 years. In the last basically 26 years, 26, 27 years. Now we are in the 27th COP. In the last 27 years, on what has happened, because much is not progressing, especially in accelerating climate action. But is that convening important? I would say it's important because we share the same atmosphere. Africa doesn't have its own atmosphere. Germany, the European Union countries, the Asia, they don't have, we share the same atmosphere. So at the end of the day, we have to find some sort of convergence in ensuring that we discuss, and also at least we agree on how to address the climate crisis. But we should call off our governments. Let us call our governments that they have failed in addressing the climate crisis in the last 27 years, that they should stop the talk and move to action. Basically, what is happening is a lot of talk shops, a lot of deals in negotiations. One country is favoring the other because they are doing an ABCD project in this and this country. I think we have a space to call them into order. I think your second question is very important. We need to unite against what our governments are doing. And we should ask ourselves from where we sit, what kind of capacity do we have in mobilizing against our governments? What kind of tactics do we want? Not that we want to cause a revolution in our countries, but I think we can have a climate justice revolution where we can say, we can tell our countries like Germany, for example, we can tell our countries like Canada for example, like the US, for example, enough is enough. What you are doing in terms of, like, for example, the US, which has been a bottleneck in negotiations, what you are doing in negotiations is not right for the progress in terms of addressing the climate crisis. We need to call off our governments, because most of these countries are blocking the key issues in progressing, and we get disappointed from one COP to the other. We should ask ourselves, for how long are we going to get disappointed in these convenings? So let us call for no more talks, no more just empty discussions or rhetorics, but discussions that will address the climate crisis. The convening is important because we convene world leaders who should actually make decisions on how the world would progress. But that convening should also be based on action and not just mere talk. So let us unite together. Let us say that the previous COPs have failed to deliver a mechanism that could accelerate climate action, and tell them where they have failed in terms of advancing the climate change agenda and what they need to do, so that at least as they come to COP27, like you say, it might be another talk if we do not put our leaders into task, because that's where our problems are. The negotiators who negotiate on behalf of these countries, they are under instruction from their own countries on how the economy should develop in their own countries, and that's where they are blocking most of the things to do with climate finance, technology transfer, and the capacity that is required. So let us call our governments into order, and even the negotiators who are negotiating on behalf of our governments, because of course they are advised from higher officers on what to do. So they are not acting just on their own behalf. If the US president comes to the COP and says that US is doing all these good things, but let us see it in action, the negotiators also making it progressive in terms of actions. So COPs have failed, but we agree that it is a mechanism that can bring us together. Let us push our countries in addressing the climate crisis. Yeah, thanks for bringing up the China issue. And I will respond in the next 2 minutes because I know time is running. Basically, the confusion and that we have in Africa is China is one of the biggest, is actually the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. But within the negotiation, it's still termed as a developing country. So it brings a lot of confusion in terms of where to place them in negotiations, because being a big emitter, but still a developing country that requires support, there is some sort of confusion. I think we need to work towards moving China from developing country to a developed country, so that they are also bound to the commitments in terms of what developed countries should do in addressing the climate crisis. But the other confusion with China and the other diplomatic issues is that China is now one of the biggest funders of the infrastructure in the African continent. And most of the countries have big infrastructure projects that are being funded by China. And calling off China by some of the African countries has become a problem because of the diplomatic ties that they have, based on the loans that some African countries, the cheap loans that the African countries receive for their own infrastructure, be it roads, be it industries, etc., and etc. But I think there is an emerging discussion in Africa on why China is being seen, why there is much inflammation of the East in development in Africa than the West. And I think it's a continuing conversation, but we should not lose the sight on what China is doing in terms of emissions, but also move towards moving them to take also up their actions in terms of reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions, and also moving them to other countries to have a developed kind of stature, so that they are also bound to the commitments within the Paris Agreement and also the convention. So I will stop it at that. I think it's 16:30 in Nairobi. I know it's 3:30 in Germany. If I would stop there, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, CCI. Thank you for the Fridays for Future. Let us continue collaborating and also working together. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Bye-bye. Yeah. Thanks very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.